asked her
Life's
to
short, dear.
describe the
Don't let
morning everything
opportunities
changed.
slip away.
Not the
I know,
leather,
it's just hard
not the
sometimes.
chrome,
I know.
not the wall of broad shoulders blocking out the July sun on Elm Street. What she remembered first was the sound, a low rolling vibration that climbed up through the soles of her shoes and into her bones, like the earth itself had decided to clear its throat. But that was Friday morning. This story does not begin on a Friday. It begins on a Thursday night in November, 21 years before, when the rain came down so hard it sounded like gravel on the roof, and a boy walked through her door who looked like he had been swallowed by the dark and spat back out. Ruth was 39 years old in the autumn of 2003. She had the hands of a woman who had worked every day of her adult life, rough at the knuckles, stained faintly with coffee, and cast iron seasoning nails cut short because long nails had no business near a commercial grill. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, and she moved through the narrow space behind the counter of Ruth's counter with the efficient economy of someone who had done the same dance 10,000 times and no longer needed to think about the steps. The diner sat on the corner of Elm Street and 3rd and Casper, Wyoming, a block and a half from the on-ramp to Interstate 25. It was not a beautiful building. It had never been a beautiful building. It was a squat, single-story structure with a flat roof that collected puddles in the rain, a hand-painted sign above the door that George had painted himself the summer they opened, and a row of windows along the front wall that let in the flat Wyoming light in the mornings and glowed amber and warm at night like a lantern set out for travelers. George Calloway had built the diner with his own hands, or as close to his own hands as a man could manage with 2 small boys underfoot and a bank loan that barely covered materials. He had laid the checkerboard linoleum himself, 1 square at a time, on his knees over a long weekend in May of 1991. He had installed the lunch counter with the 8 red vinyl stools, the padded booths along the window wall, the pass-through between the dining room and the kitchen, where Ruth could see the grill and the grill could see her. George died in March of 2001, a heart attack sudden and total on a Tuesday morning before the breakfast rush. He was 44 years old. He was carrying a sheet pan of biscuits from the oven to the warming rack when his heart simply decided it was finished. The pan hit the floor. Ruth heard it from the dining room and knew the way a person sometimes knows things. They have no logical reason to know that the sound was not an ordinary sound. She had run the diner alone since then. Their 2 sons, Thomas and Daniel, had moved to Denver by 2002 each, with young families of their own, each carrying the particular guilt of men who have left their mother behind and have learned to live with it. They called on Sundays. They came for Thanksgiving when they could. They offered periodically to help her sell the diner and move closer to them, and she declined each time with the same quiet patience she used on customers who tried to send back food she knew was perfectly fine. The diner was the last place George's hands had touched every day. His signature was still on the business license in the frame behind the register. His spatula hung on a hook above the grill, the handle worn smooth in the shape of his grip. Ruth had not used it since he died. She couldn't explain why she kept it there, except that some things are not meant to be used anymore. Some things are meant to be witnessed. By the autumn of 2003, the diner was struggling, but alive. The breakfast rush was reliable truckers off the interstate, a handful of regulars who had been coming in since the 90s, the occasional family making time before a long drive. Lunch was decent on Mondays and Tuesdays. Dinner was thin most nights, thinner on weeknights, and Ruth had taken to closing at 10 instead of 11 to save on electricity and the particular exhaustion of standing in an empty room. She made the meatloaf every Tuesday. It had been George's recipe, adjusted over the years by small measures of instinct and habit until it was entirely hers. She served it with mashed potatoes, brown gravy made from the drippings, and 2 slices of Texas toast buttered, while still hot from the broiler. It was the most popular item on the menu on Tuesdays. By Thursday, if there was any left, it was usually dry enough to be charitable about. On the night of November 14th, 2003, there was still 1 serving left. The rain had started in the early afternoon and had not stopped. By 9 o'clock, it was the kind of rain that discourages everything conversation, movement, optimism. It came down in solid gray sheets across the parking lot, turned the street lights on Elm into smeared orange blurs, drummed against the flat roof of the diner in a sound like distant applause that never quite stopped. The interstate was quieter than usual. Only 2 customers had come in for dinner, a pair of long-haul drivers who sat at the counter, ate without talking, paid without lingering, and were gone by 8:30. Ruth was alone. She had wiped down the counter twice. She had refilled the sugar dispensers in the napkin holders and the ketchup bottles. She had swept the floor and was considering whether to mop it now or in the morning when the bell above the door made its small, bright sound and she looked up. The boy stood in the doorway. He was 12 years old, though she would not learn that until later. In the moment standing there in the entrance of her diner, with the rain roaring behind him and the November cold pouring in around him like something alive, he could have been any age that suffering makes a person. He was thin in the way that is not the same as being lean, the thinness of deprivation of meals missed and meals skipped and meals never offered. His jeans were dark with water from the knee down. The denim jacket he wore was 3 sizes too large, the sleeves hanging past his wrists, the collar turned up against a cold it was too thin to stop. Beneath it, a gray t-shirt clung to his narrow chest. His hair was dark and plastered flat against his forehead by the rain. And his eyes were blue. Not a soft blue, not the easy, forgettable blue of a clear sky. They were a deep, sharp, specific blue, the color of deep water or of a gas flame. And they were moving around the room with the rapid, systematic awareness of someone who has learned to read a room quickly and accurately as a matter of survival. The door, the counter, the pass-through, the back exit, Ruth, the display case, Ruth again. In the display case under the fluorescent light, the last slice of cherry pie sat on its paper doily, slowly drying out. Ruth's first instinct was the same instinct she had acted on 1,000 times, a reflex of the tired and the practical and the ready to be done for the evening. "Kitchen's closed," she said. Her voice was not unkind. It was simply the voice of a woman who was tired and had learned that tiredness honestly expressed is its own kind of truth. The boy did not move. He stood just inside the doorway, and the rain continued behind him, and his eyes stayed on the display case on the cherry pie, and something in the way he looked at it made Ruth's reflex lose its footing. She had seen hunger before. Working-class Wyoming was not a place where a person could avoid it entirely. She had seen the careful way certain families ordered the parents getting coffee, only the kids getting one plate to share the whole table, pretending that was preference rather than calculation. She had seen men come in at closing time and order the cheapest thing on the menu and nurse it for an hour and leave a tip that was clearly the last cash in their pocket. But the way this boy looked at that pie was different from all of those things. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they have already decided they cannot have. Ruth put down her rag. She walked to the end of the counter and around it into the dining room. And as she moved toward the boy, he did something she would not forget. He took one step backward. Not a full step, not a panicked retreat, just one instinctive step back, his shoulders tightening slightly, his chin coming up, the automatic flinch of a child who has learned that adults moving toward him usually means something is about to be taken away. She stopped. She kept her distance. She kept her voice level and low, the way she would have spoken to a stray dog she wanted to convince that she was not a threat. "Where are your parents?" The boy said nothing. His jaw was set. His eyes had gone from the pie to her face, and they were doing that rapid assessment again, reading her, measuring her, deciding how much danger she represented. She noticed then that he was favoring his left side very slightly. Not dramatically, not the wince of someone in acute pain, but the subtle compensation of someone who has been hurting for a while and has gotten used to working around it. His left arm hung a little lower. He shifted his weight to his right hip when he stood still. She noticed the bruising at his collar, too. Faint, partially hidden by the turned-up denim, the yellow-green of bruises that were several days old and fading. She had raised 2 sons. She knew what a boy looked like when someone had put hands on him. The boy reached into the pocket of the oversized jacket. For a single electric second, Ruth's heart did something complicated. Then he pulled out his hand, and she saw what he was holding, a fistful of coins, loose change, pennies and nickels and a few dimes, and he leaned forward and set them on the nearest table with the flat, decisive sound of someone making a transaction. "Coffee," he said. His voice was rough, underused, the voice of someone who had not spoken to another person in several days. "Just coffee." Ruth looked at the coins. She looked at him. She did the arithmetic, which was not complicated. "Put your money away," she said. "I can pay." His chin was still up. The pride in his voice was fierce and breakable and heartbreaking all at once. I know you can. Put it away anyway. She pulled out the nearest chair. Sit down, booth 4 near the heater. You're going to catch your death standing in a wet jacket. He looked at the door. He looked at her. He looked at the door again. The heater was running along the wall beside booth 4, and the warmth of it was reaching all the way to where he stood, and his body was making the decision before his pride could stop it. He moved to the booth and slid in along the red vinyl, and the jacket was so large that when he hunched into the corner, he almost disappeared inside it. Ruth went into the kitchen. The grill was scraped and cooling. The fryer was off and draining. The prep surfaces were clean. She looked at all of this for a moment, the dark and resting kitchen already put to bed for the night, and then she turned the flat top back on. She took the last slab of meatloaf from the refrigerator, still wrapped in the plastic wrap she had put around it that afternoon, and she set it on the warming surface. She loaded a pot with the mashed potatoes and set it over low heat. She ladled the gravy into the small saucepan and turned it on. She took 2 slices of bread and put them under the broiler and waited for them to color. She was not in the habit of explaining herself, even to herself. She did not stand in the kitchen and have a moment of reflection about kindness or charity or what the boy might need. She just cooked the food the way she cooked food because that was what the kitchen was for and that was what she knew how to do. When she came out of the kitchen with the plate meatloaf, mashed potatoes, brown gravy poured over both 2 slices of golden Texas toast, the boy was asleep. He had laid his head down on his folded arms on the table, the way a young child sleeps at school, deeply and without embarrassment, and his chest was rising and falling in the slow, heavy rhythm of someone who has not slept in a real bed for a long time. His face in sleep had lost the taut wariness of his waking expression. He looked exactly as old as he was, which was not very old at all. Ruth set the plate down quietly. She leaned close. Hey, she said softly, wake up. He startled awake with the sudden, total alertness of someone not accustomed to sleeping soundly, both hands flat on the table, eyes open and scanning before he was fully conscious. Then the smell of the food reached him and his whole body changed. His shoulders dropped. His hands relaxed. He looked at the plate in front of him and then up at her with an expression she had never quite seen before in a human face, a mixture of disbelief and a hunger so deep it was almost formal, like something that had been waiting a very long time to be acknowledged. I didn't order this, he said. I can't pay for this. It's on the house, Ruth said. She sat down in the booth across from him. Mistake in the kitchen. If you don't eat it, it goes in the trash. You'd be doing me a favor. He looked at her for one more second. Then he picked up the fork. She had seen people eat hungrily before. This was different. This was about eating with the complete unself-conscious ferocity of someone whose body had been in a state of emergency and had only now in this moment been given permission to stand down. He did not look up. He did not speak. He simply ate steadily and seriously, working through the meatloaf and the potatoes and the toast with a focused intensity that told her everything she needed to know about how long it had been since his last real meal. Ruth poured him a glass of milk and set it beside the plate without comment. She sat with him while he ate. She did not ask him questions. She did not perform concern or offer advice or try to extract information that would let her categorize the situation and decide what the appropriate response was. She simply sat in the booth across from a hungry boy and let him eat in peace, which was, she had found over the years, the rarest and most valuable thing you can offer a person who is used to being interrogated every time someone does something decent for them. When the plate was clean, and it was clean, scraped clean, the way a plate gets when someone has been hungry enough to stop caring about appearances, the boy sat back against the vinyl. The color had come back into his face. His shoulders had dropped from around his ears. He looked for the first time since walking through the door like and not a small cornered animal. Thank you, he said. His voice was stronger now. Ruth collected the plate. You got a place to sleep tonight. The wall came back immediately. She watched it go up, his eyes hardening, his chin lifting again, all the careful armor reassembling itself in the space of a single breath. I'm fine. It's below freezing. I said I'm fine. He was already reaching for the jacket, already calculating the distance to the door. Ruth did not push. She stood up with the plate and carried it toward the kitchen and paused with her back to him. "I've got a cot in the back office," she said. "It's warm. Door locks from the outside. Nobody can get in. I don't need charity." "I know you don't." She turned. "I need someone to watch the building tonight. There's been a rash of break-ins on this block. $40 if you're still here in the morning." It was, of course, a lie. There had been no break-ins. But it was a good lie, the kind that gives a person with pride something to stand on while accepting help. And she watched him weigh it. He stood up from the booth. He was heading for the door. He stopped with his hand on the push bar and stood there for a moment with his back to her, looking out at the rain through the glass. Then he turned around. His face was different now. Not the wariness, not the pride, not the careful blankness he'd worn since walking in. He was looking at her the way people look at something they are trying to memorize, storing it somewhere reliable against the possibility that they might need it later. "I'm Eli," he said. "I'm Ruth." A pause. The rain, the heater, the hum of the refrigerator. "I won't forget this, Ruth." He said it quietly and directly without drama. "I promise." He pushed through the door and walked out into the rain, and the darkness took him. Ruth went to the window, but the night had already closed behind him, seamless and dark. She stood there for a moment with her hand flat against the cold glass, looking out at the empty parking lot, the rain coming down in silver needles through the cone of the parking lot light. Then she turned off the kitchen lights and began closing up. The next morning when Ruth came in at 5:30 to start the coffee, she went to booth 4 to wipe it down before the breakfast rush. The coins were still there on the table, but they had been moved. Sometime in the night before he left, and she did not know when he had left or whether he had slept at all, or how long he had sat in the warmth of that booth before the road called him back, Eli had arranged the loose change into a shape on the formica surface. Pennies and nickels and dimes placed with what must have been considerable care in the dim light, arranged into the unmistakable outline of a heart. Small, precise, left deliberately. Ruth stood looking at it for a long time. She could hear the coffee brewing in the kitchen, the first pale light of a Wyoming November, coming through the front windows, the distant sound of a truck on the interstate. Then she went behind the counter and found a small glass jar, one of the jam jars she kept for serving cream, and she came back to the booth and picked up the coins, one by one, and put them in the jar. She screwed the lid on. She set it on the shelf beneath the register, behind a stack of paper guest checks, where it wouldn't be in the way. She did not examine why she kept them. She did not have a theory about it. She simply kept them the way a person keeps a thing they are not ready to throw away. That jar sat in the same spot through every season that followed, through the slow erosion of the years, through the changes and the losses and the grinding work of keeping a small business alive by sheer stubbornness. The re-roofing job in 2009 when the flat roof finally gave up. The breakfast rush that gradually thinned as the interstate bypassed them in 2018 and took most of the truck traffic with it. The 2 summers when Ruth's arthritis was bad enough that she had to hire a teenager named Marcus from 2 blocks over just to help with the grill. The jar stayed. 21 years is a long time. It is long enough for a boy to become a man and for a woman to become something harder and quieter and more certain of what matters. It is long enough for a town to change so thoroughly that the things it used to be are visible only in gaps and absences, the empty lots where buildings used to be the faded ghost signs on brick walls, the people who remember what was there before and have stopped mentioning it because nobody asks anymore. By the summer of 2024, Casper had changed. The new money had come in the way new money always comes quietly at first, in the form of consultants and real estate agents and architectural renders presented at city council meetings. Then all at once in the form of construction fences and demolition notices and cranes rising above the old downtown blocks like metal herons standing in shallow water. The man behind most of it was named Conrad Price. He was 53 years old, and he had the particular bearing of someone who had been told he was exceptional for so long that he had come to experience the world primarily as a series of things not yet arranged to his satisfaction. He was tall, thin, in the way of men who exercise as a form of aggression, and he wore suits that cost more than Ruth made in a month. His company, Pinnacle Development Group, had spent the better part of 18 months buying up the block on Elm Street, one property at a time, the mechanic shop, the coin laundry, the vacant lot that used to be a hardware store. The project was called Summit Plaza. The rendering showed a gleaming 3-story complex with luxury retail on the ground floor, boutique office spaces above a rooftop terrace. The word revitalization appeared in every document connected to it. So did the phrase transformational investment and the phrase addressing underutilized commercial space, which was the language Price used when he meant he wanted to tear something down. The only property on the block he did not own was Ruth's counter. He had made his first offer in December of 2023. It was, Ruth had to admit, a fair offer, more than the building was worth, by any conventional measure, more than she would have made selling it herself. She had declined without extensive deliberation. He had made a second offer in February, higher. She had declined. A third offer in April, lower, the first sign of the shift in strategy, the beginning of the pressure campaign. She had declined. What followed was 6 months of the kind of sustained, low-level institutional harassment that is designed to grind a person down without leaving marks. The city health inspector began appearing at Ruth's counter 2 and 3 times a week, citing violations that no previous inspection had ever found: a crack in a floor tile, a condensation drip from the refrigeration unit, a question about the hood vent certification. Each citation had to be appealed and resolved. Each resolution cost time and attorney fees and energy that Ruth did not have to spare. The power began going out during the lunch rush, always briefly, always with the utility company expressing bafflement, always on the days she had a full dining room. The loading dock behind the diner was blocked twice by a truck that had no manifest and no driver Ruth could locate, and whose plates, when she eventually wrote them down and asked a friend at the DM5 to run them, came back registered to a shell company she could not trace. She knew what it was. She wasn't naive. She had grown up in Wyoming, and she knew what it looked like when a man with resources decided to remove an obstacle. She complained to the city. She wrote letters. She spoke to a lawyer who told her she had no actionable evidence. Through all of it, she opened the diner every morning at 6 and ran the grill until closing. She made the meatloaf every Tuesday. She kept the jar of coins beneath the register. The morning Conrad Price walked through her door with his final offer. It was a Tuesday in July, the kind of Wyoming summer day that arrives with the flat, brilliant certainty of a declaration. Ruth was behind the counter. The breakfast rush had been quiet: 3 regulars, 2 cups of coffee, each gone by 9. She was working through the week's receipts, the numbers arranged in front of her, with the same patience she brought to everything, even bad news. Price came in at 10:15. He did not sit down. He never sat down. Sitting down would have implied that this was a negotiation, and Price had clearly decided several months ago that the negotiation was over. He was flanked by 2 men. One was a lawyer she recognized from his previous visits, a young man named Aldrich, who had the permanently apologetic look of someone who knows exactly what he's facilitating and has decided his mortgage is more important than his conscience. The other was a man she had come to know as Stack's heavyset, former military or former law enforcement, or both sunglasses indoors, the particular blank attentiveness of someone paid to be physically large in specific rooms. "Mrs. Calloway," Price said. The voice was the voice of a man accustomed to being listened to. "We need to bring this to a close." Ruth did not look up from the receipts. "The diner's not for sale, Mr. Price. That position hasn't changed." Price exhaled slowly, the exhale of a man performing patience for an audience of 1. He placed a thick envelope on the counter beside her ledger. She did not pick it up. "My patience has a limit, as all things do," he said. "I purchased your mortgage note from the Natrona First Bank yesterday afternoon. You are currently 3 payments behind. Under the terms of the original loan agreement, that constitutes a default that allows the new note holder, which is now me, to demand full repayment or initiate foreclosure proceedings." Ruth looked up. Jerry Hollis would never. "Jerry Hollis was let go last week," Price said. The word "let go" landed with the particular flatness of a door being shut. "The note transferred through proper legal channels. The remaining balance is $142,000. You have 72 hours to pay it in full or sign the sale documents." He slid the envelope toward her. "The offer in there is considerably lower than my previous offer because, frankly, Mrs. Calloway, you have cost me a significant amount of time and money and delay, and the adjustment reflects that." Ruth said nothing. She was looking at a point just past his shoulder at the framed business license on the wall where George's signature sat in blue ink, 30 years old and permanent. Price nodded to Stacks. Stacks stepped forward and picked up the glass jar from the counter, the jar she kept for daily tip collection, and turned it slightly in his hand, examining it with theatrical disinterest, and then set it back down with just enough force that it tipped and fell and shattered against the linoleum coins, skittering and spinning in every direction. Oops, Stack said. 72 hours, Price said. Friday at noon I'll be back. If the balance is not paid and the papers are not signed, I'll bring the foreclosure order to bearer and the city demolition permit simultaneously. Aldrich has both ready to file. He turned toward the door. He paused with his hand on the push bar, the same push bar where a cold, wet boy had paused 21 years earlier and glanced back at her over his shoulder. Try to be practical, Mrs. Calloway. Sentiment is an expensive luxury. The door opened. The door closed. They were gone. Ruth stood behind the counter for a long time without moving. Then she came around the counter and sat down on the floor among the scattered coins and the pieces of the broken jar, her back against the cabinet below the register, her knees drawn up, and she wept with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has learned to cry without wasting too much time on it. The breakfast light came in flat and gold through the front windows, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the building settling, the sound of an 18-wheeler passing on the interstate far away and going somewhere. She reached down among the coins and found a piece of the broken jar, curved glass thick at the base, and as she turned it over in her fingers, the edge of it caught her thumb, and she felt the small, bright sting of the cut in the first bead of blood, and she held her thumb pressed against her palm and sat there on the floor of George's diner with her eyes closed. She had kept this place alive for 23 years without him. She had gotten up before dawn every single morning and made the coffee and turned on the grill and opened the door because the door needed to be open and there was no one else to open it. And it was going to end like this. On a Tuesday in July, because a man in an expensive suit had decided that her corner of Elm Street would look better as a luxury shopping complex. The woman who saved Ruth's counter was not yet aware that she was about to do it. Della Hurst was 28 years old, and she ran a local news blog called the Casper Record from her apartment 3 blocks away. She wrote about city council decisions, local business openings, utility disputes, the kind of hyper-local journalism that the internet had mostly killed and that she was determined to keep alive by sheer personal conviction and a modest Substack subscription base. She had a camera, a decent one, nothing professional, and an instinct for the kind of story that made people feel something about the place they lived. She had heard about Ruth's situation through a customer of Ruth's who knew her mother. She came in on Wednesday afternoon, the day after Price's visit, and asked Ruth if she could record a short interview. Ruth hesitated. She was a private woman. She had lived her life primarily in the doing of things, rather than the talking about them. But she looked around the diner, the space George had built, the linoleum he had laid one square at a time, the spatula on the hook, the shelf where the tip jar used to sit, and she thought about the fact that by this time Friday, it might all be in, and she thought with the careful, pragmatic logic of someone who has exhausted all other options that she had nothing left to lose. All right, she said, but I want to sit in booth 4. Della set up her camera on a small tripod. She sat across from Ruth in the booth. The afternoon light came in through the front windows at a low angle the way it does in Wyoming in July, and it lit up the side of Ruth's face and the counter behind her and the shelf where the small glass jar of coins sat barely visible in the background. Della asked about the diner, about George, about the years alone, about Price. Ruth answered each question in the direct, unadorned way she approached most things, without drama, without self-pity, without performing her own suffering for the camera. Then Della asked a question that was not on her list. She asked it because something in Ruth's face, the way it softened slightly when she talked about keeping the door open for everyone who needed it, made her curious about where that instinct came from. Ruth, she said, you've fed half this town for free at one point or another. People who couldn't pay people who needed a warm place. Where does that come from? Ruth was quiet for a moment. She looked at the table surface. Then she looked at the camera with the steady, undramatic gaze of someone telling a true thing. I had a boy come in once, she said. Long time ago, November 2003. A rainy night late, I was about to close. He was 12 years old and he had walked in off the street and he was soaking wet. And he was hungry in the way that you can see when someone hasn't eaten for a long time. I fed him, that's all. I fed him and I sat with him while he ate, and I didn't ask him anything because I could see he needed to eat more than he needed to be questioned. Della waited. He told me his name when he left, Ruth said. He said he wouldn't forget. I never saw him again. She paused. I kept hoping over the years, I kept thinking, if I put enough good into the world might hold me up when I needed it. She looked down at the table. I suppose I'm still waiting to find out if that's true. Della uploaded the video that evening. She titled it The Last Day of Ruth's Counter. It was honest and raw and unglamorous, and it got 1,200 views by midnight, most of them from Casper. Most of them people who knew Ruth or knew of her or had eaten at her counter at one point in their lives. Comments of sympathy, shares to local Facebook groups. A GoFundMe started by a teenager that raised $400 before midnight and stalled. It was not enough. Nothing that happened on Wednesday was enough. But at 11:47 that night, when Ruth had already gone home and turned off the lights and was lying in the dark in the house on Colfax Street that still had George's work boots by the back door, an account on a national biker forum reposted Della's video with a caption that was 8 words long. Brothers, Casper, Wyoming, Ruth's Counter, Friday, ride. No name attached to the account. No explanation. No context. But by morning, the post had been shared 300 times across 4 different platforms, and somewhere out on the interstate system of the American West, on roads that ran through Utah and Nevada and Colorado and Montana, the sound of engines was already changing. Something was coming. Ruth did not know it yet. She was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, reading a foreclosure document with the methodical attention of someone who understands the importance of knowing exactly how they are being beaten. She was 60 years old and she was tired, and her thumb still ached from the cut of the broken glass. And outside the kitchen window, the Wyoming morning was coming in big and blue and indifferent the way mornings do when they have no opinion about what the day is going to bring you. She picked up George's spatula from the counter where she had laid it the night before, wrapped in the dish towel already packed. She held it in both hands for a long time. Then she set it back down unwrapped on the counter. Not yet. Friday morning arrived the way consequential mornings often do, without fanfare, without ceremony, with the same flat indifference the sun brings to every day, regardless of what that day intends to do to the people standing in it. Ruth was at the diner by 5:15. She had not slept. Not in any real sense. She had lain in the dark on her side of the bed, still her side after all these years. The left side because George had always taken the right, and some arrangements outlast the people who created them, and she had watched the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her and thought about numbers, the $142,000, the 72 hours that were now down to 14, the $400 sitting in a GoFundMe account that some teenager had started with good intentions and no understanding of how large the gap was between 400 and 142,000. She got up at 4:30, made coffee she barely tasted, and drove to Elm Street in the dark. She let herself in through the back. She turned on the kitchen light. She stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment, with her hands at her sides, looking at the grill, the prep tables, the pass through the hook where George's spatula hung. She had brought it back with her this morning, rewrapped in the dish towel, and she hung it back on the hook in its proper place before she did anything else. Some things belonged where they belonged for as long as they could. She started the coffee. She prepped the line. She did it all with the same careful attention she had brought to every morning for 23 years, because the body knows its work even when the mind is somewhere else entirely, and because there is a particular dignity in doing a thing properly all the way to the end. By 6 o'clock, the diner was ready to open, the way it was ready every morning, coffee made, grill seasoned and hot. The front door unlocked, the neon sign in the window buzzing to life in its familiar amber glow. Ruth turned the sign to open and stood for a moment looking out through the glass at Elm Street in the early morning light. The street was quiet. The summer morning was already warm, the sky a pale, washed-out blue above the rooftops. A delivery truck moved slowly past on 3rd Street half a block away. A dog was barking somewhere in the distance with the persistent mechanical optimism of a dog that believes this time someone will come. At the far end of Elm Street, Ruth could see the fence line of the construction staging area Price had established 3 weeks ago. Behind the fence, she could see the upper outline of 2 yellow bulldozers parked in waiting, enormous, impatient in the early light, the way large machinery always looks, patient, indifferent to time, in a way that only things without any stake in the outcome can afford to be. Ruth looked at them for a moment. Then she turned and went back to the grill. Three customers came in for breakfast. Old Mr. Fenwick, who had been coming in every weekday morning since 1998, who was 77 years old and ordered the same thing every time: 2 eggs over easy wheat toast, black coffee, small orange juice, and who ate with the unhurried dignity of a man who has reached the age where he has decided that meals are important enough to take seriously. He did not mention the foreclosure. He did not mention Price or the bulldozers or the GoFundMe. He ate his eggs and read a section of the newspaper he had folded to the crossword and left a $5 tip on a $7 check the way he always did. Then the Alderman sisters, Patrice and Gwen, both in their late 60s, who walked every morning from their house on Birch Street and rewarded themselves with coffee and a shared order of pancakes at the end. They were the kind of women who had known Ruth for 20 years and loved her in the practical, unsentimental way of long acquaintance. And this morning, Patrice had held Ruth's hand across the counter for a moment without saying anything, which was the most honest thing anyone had done for her in days. They left at 7:45. After that, the diner was empty. Ruth cleaned the grill. She restocked the condiment holders. She wiped the counter. She looked at the clock. She wiped the counter again. By 10 o'clock, the silence in the diner had taken on a specific texture. Not the comfortable silence of a slow morning, but the pressurized quiet of a room where something is about to happen. Ruth had lived long enough to know the difference. She went to the shelf beneath the register and took down the small glass jar. Not the broken one, she had swept that up on Tuesday. This was a different jar, a mason jar she had found in the pantry, and she had transferred the coins into it that same evening, the coins from the heart-shaped arrangement in booth 4, the pennies and nickels and dimes that a 12-year-old boy had left behind on a rainy November night 21 years ago. She set the jar on the counter in front of her. She looked at it the way she sometimes looked at things she had been carrying for a long time without fully understanding why the way you look at an object that has been with you through so much that it has stopped being just an object and started being something closer to a record. Evidence of a particular moment, proof that the moment had been real. She was still looking at it when she heard the car doors in the parking lot. Conrad Price arrived at 11:30, 30 minutes early. She had expected 11:55, the theatrical last minute of a man who wanted her to spend as long as possible in anticipation. The 30-minute early arrival was a different kind of theater, the theater of a man so certain of his outcome that punctuality had become optional. He came in with Stacks and a different lawyer, this time not young Aldrich, but an older man with the practiced blankness of senior litigation counsel, someone brought in specifically for the formality of a closing. There was a briefcase. There were documents already arrayed inside it. Ruth could see when the lawyer set it on the counter and opened it, papers organized with tabs and markers ready for signature. Price was wearing a hard hat. It was yellow, brand new, and he wore it with the specific self-satisfaction of a man who considers it a prop and knows it. He looked around the diner the way a person looks at a room they have already mentally emptied and refurnished, cataloging what will go where when the current contents have been removed. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "it's time." "I have 30 minutes, Ruth said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "There's no reason to wait 30 minutes. The outcome is determined. Let's make this clean and efficient." He nodded toward the papers. "Sign the sale agreement and the note transfer confirmation. You walk away with whatever's in the GoFundMe and your personal effects. I'll give you until tomorrow noon to clear out the furniture." Ruth's hands were flat on the counter. She could feel the slight ridging of the laminate surface under her palms, the texture of it real and physical and present. "I have 30 minutes, she said again. Price exhaled. He looked at Stacks. He looked at the lawyer. He looked back at Ruth with the expression of a man recalculating how much of his time he is willing to spend on the specific variety of stubbornness being presented to him. "Fine," he said. He moved to one of the counter stools and sat on it and took out his phone. 30 minutes. The diner was very quiet. The clock above the pass-through showed 11:32. Ruth looked at the mason jar on the counter. She looked at the clock. She looked at George's spatula on the hook above the grill. At 11:43, the coffee cup nearest the edge of the counter began to rattle. It was subtle at first. The kind of vibration you feel in the soles of your feet before you consciously identify it as sound. A low, subsonic trembling that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the floor and the walls and the air itself. Ruth felt it in her palms where they rested on the counter. The surface of the coffee in the pot began to show small, concentric rings the way water in a glass shows the footfall of something large approaching. Price looked up from his phone. "What is that?" he said. The vibration became a hum. The hum became a rumble. The rumble became a roar, a deep, layered, resonant mechanical roar that climbed steadily in volume and frequency, like the opening bars of something enormous being played at full power, and it was coming from the west end of Elm Street, and it was not stopping. Ruth looked through the front windows. At the far end of the block, turning from Main onto Elm, came the first of them. Then the second, then 10, then 20. They came around the corner in a tight, disciplined formation that filled both lanes of the road, the sunlight striking the chrome handlebars and the polished engine cases and the black lacquer of the gas tanks in a moving wall of reflected light. They wore leather cuts and dark helmets, and they rode with the unhurried, immovable certainty of people who have decided exactly where they are going and are not in any particular hurry to justify that decision to anyone. They kept coming. Outside, Ruth could see Deputy Cord Halsey step out of his patrol car, which had been parked across the street since 11. He stood beside the open door and watched the motorcycles fill Elm Street, his hand resting on his belt, his expression unreadable from this distance. The bulldozers at the end of the block were completely blocked. Price was on his feet. "This is a public road," he said, his voice finding a higher register than it usually occupied. "They can't just, this is obstruction, this is—" He turned to the lawyer. "Call the city." The lawyer was looking out the window at the motorcycles and appeared to be making his own calculations about what city officials were going to be willing to do about 100 Hells Angels on a Friday morning in Wyoming. The column slowed. At the head of it, a single rider on a massive custom Harley-Davidson chopper, blacked out entirely, matte black frame, black engine, black pipes, raised his left fist. All 97 motorcycles stopped. The sound died, not gradually, not with the staggered, trailing quiet of traffic slowing at a light. All at once, with a synchronized precision that suggested it had been practiced or that it came from some shared instinct. Deeper than practice, 97 engines went quiet in the same second, and the silence that followed was so sudden and so complete that it had physical weight. It pressed against the windows of the diner. It filled the street. Kickstands came down, one by one, and then all at once, 97 kickstands dropped to the asphalt of Elm Street in a sound like a slow, deliberate sentence being written. The man at the head of the column dismounted. He was enormous. The word was not a figure of speech or an emotional impression, but a straightforward physical description. He stood 6 feet and 4 inches tall, with the kind of breadth through the shoulders that comes from decades of physical labor, from the kind of life that is measured in miles, in weather, in work, rather than in offices and negotiations. He had a shaved head and a thick, dark beard, shot through with gray. His arms were covered in tattoos from wrist to neck, dense and intricate, and the leather cut he wore over a black thermal shirt bore the Hells Angels' Death's Head on the back and the word Nomads on the bottom rocker. He took off his helmet. His face was weathered in the way of men who have spent most of their lives outdoors. Deep lines at the corners of his eyes, a scar that ran from his left cheekbone down toward his jaw, the particular tanned and wind-roughened complexion of someone for whom the interior of a room has always been the exception rather than the rule. And his eyes were blue. The same blue he'd had at 12 older, now marked by weather and miles and years of looking at roads that didn't end, but unmistakably the same. Pacific and sharp and capable of reading a room in 3 seconds flat. He looked through the window of the diner, scanning with the rapid awareness of someone who has always done this automatically. He found Ruth behind the counter. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he walked toward the door. Behind him, 96 men dismounted and moved to the sidewalk and to the space in front of the bulldozers and to the edges of the parking lot, and they stood there with the patient, outward-facing stillness of men who have taken up a position and intend to hold it. The bell above the door made its small, bright sound. He had to duck slightly to clear the frame. He came in and the room changed the way rooms change when certain people enter them, not through any action or announcement, but through some quality of presence that rearranges the air. He was looking at Ruth and only at Ruth, and he moved past Conrad Price with the particular quality of disregard that is more absolute than hostility. Price was not an obstacle, not a threat, not even a person to be navigated around. He simply was not relevant. Price said something. Ruth did not hear what it was. The man stopped at the counter. He reached into his leather cut. Price flinched and Stacks took a half step forward, and the lawyer went very still. And what he brought out was not a weapon. It was a piece of paper. Old paper folded many times along creases that had been folded and unfolded so often they had become soft as fabric, the surface of it yellowed and fragile with age. He unfolded it carefully with the deliberate hands of someone handling something that matters to them, and he laid it on the counter in front of Ruth. It was a receipt, a carbon copy receipt from Ruth's counter. The paper was the specific pale yellow of the receipt paper she had used in the early years before she switched to thermal. The ink was faded but legible. The date in the upper right corner read November 14th, 2003. The items listed one meatloaf, special one glass of milk. Total $8.50. Paid in full, the stamp from her old cash register. On the back in handwriting that was unmistakably the handwriting of a child. Unsteady, effortful, each letter formed with the careful concentration of someone who had not written much and knew it were two words: I owe you. Ruth looked at the receipt. She looked up. She looked at the blue eyes across the counter from her, and 21 years collapsed into nothing at all. Hi, Ruth, he said. His voice was low and rough, and there was something in it that was not quite steady. Kitchen still open. The silence in the diner was total. Ruth's hand moved before she decided to move it. She reached across the counter, and her fingers found the scar on his cheek, the long scar from cheekbone to jaw, and she touched it gently the way you touch something you are not entirely sure is real. You're the boy, she said, the one with the denim jacket. I was the boy. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more complicated. Now they call me Anvil. Eli. She said his name the way she had said it only a handful of times in the 21 years since, when she'd thought about that night, which she had more often than she would have admitted to anyone. I always wondered if you were okay. He went very still. Not the careful stillness of someone controlling their reaction, but the stillness of someone who has just been struck by something they weren't braced for. He looked at her with those blue eyes inhabited now by a man who had lived 21 years of a life that had left marks, but the essential quality of them unchanged, still that same watchful, guarded, deeply private intelligence she had seen in a boy standing in a doorway in the rain. You wondered about me, he said. Of course I did. Simple, factual, the way Ruth said most true things. Eli looked at the counter. His jaw worked once. He put both large hands flat on the laminate and took a breath through his nose and let it out slowly, and when he looked back up, his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with anger. Excuse me. Conrad Price's voice cut across the moment like something thrown. He had stepped forward and was standing behind Eli's left shoulder, his phone in his hand, his hard hat still on. The theater of it was ruined now. The hard hat looked absurd, but he did not appear to have noticed. I don't know who you are or what this little reunion is about, but this woman has a debt that is due in, he checked his watch, 17 minutes. Unless you are presenting a certified cashier's check for $142,000, I suggest you and your friends clear the road and let this transaction conclude. Eli did not turn around. He did not turn around in the same way that a mountain does not turn around when someone speaks to it from a few feet away. He reached down to the saddlebag he had carried in over one shoulder. Heavy black leather, the straps dark with road use, and he set it on the counter with a solid final sound that rattled the napkin holders and made the coffee cups chime against their saucers. He unbuckled the straps with the calm of someone performing a routine task. He upended the bag. Bundles of cash came out, hundreds banded in rubber bands, dense and real, and immediately countable by the eye, even without the exact count. They tumbled and stacked and spread across the countertop in an unruly, undeniable pile that pushed the mason jar of coins to one side and covered the foreclosure documents the lawyer had laid out and reached the edge of the counter before the bag was empty. $150,000, Eli said, covers the debt. The rest is a tip. Ruth's hands went to her mouth. Della Hurst in the corner booth where she had been sitting with her camera since before opening. She had texted Ruth the night before and asked if she could be there, and Ruth had agreed because she was still operating on the logic of having nothing left to lose, zoomed in on the pile of money with the focused, silent attention of someone who understands that they are witnessing something that needs to be documented. Price stared at the cash. Then he smiled. It was a specific kind of smile, not the smile of a man who has been defeated, but the smile of a man who has just seen his opponent play a card he already knew how to counter. "I don't accept cash," Price said. "Company policy, anti-money laundering compliance. The contract stipulates payment by certified cashier's check or verified wire transfer only." He spread his hands in a gesture of regret that contained no actual regret whatsoever. "It's in the fine print of the mortgage note, Mrs. Calloway. Your banker friend here should have mentioned that when he drafted it." He looked at his watch again. 15 minutes. You cannot get to a bank and back in 15 minutes. The property defaults to me at noon. He looked at Eli with the expression of a man explaining a game to someone who has only just sat down at the table. "I'm sorry. Truly." He was not sorry. Eli finally turned around. He turned slowly, the way he did everything with the patient, deliberate economy of someone who has learned that urgency is usually someone else's problem. He looked at Price for a moment with an expression of what appeared to be mild professional disappointment, the way a craftsman looks at a job done incorrectly by someone who should have known better. "I figured you'd be difficult," Eli said. He took a phone from his vest pocket, not a smartphone, a battered flip phone, the kind that still exists primarily in the hands of people who have specific reasons for preferring them. He opened it and dialed a number from memory, held it to his ear. "Bring him in," he said. He closed the phone. 30 seconds passed. The bell above the door jingled. Two nomads entered, between them walking with the specific stiffness of a man who is very nervous and is trying to look less nervous than he is, came a third person. He was in his late 40s, wearing a gray short-sleeved shirt with a pen in the breast pocket, glasses slightly fogged from the July heat outside, and the expression of someone who had been sitting in a motorcycle sidecar for the last 20 minutes, working himself into a state. Ruth recognized him. "Gareth," she said. Gareth Pullman, who had managed the Natrona First Bank branch on Center Street for 11 years, before being walked out of the building by Human Resources 8 days ago with a severance check in a non-disclosure agreement he had signed without reading. Carefully enough, looked at Ruth with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it and is absolutely terrified. "Hello, Ruth," he said. Price stared at him. "You have no standing here. You were terminated. Whatever access you think you have. The NDAI sign covers disclosure of client financial information," Gareth said. He had clearly rehearsed this. His voice was thin, but it stayed on the line he had prepared for it. "It does not prohibit me from performing a banking function that I am legally still authorized to perform because Pinnacle Development Group's legal team moved fast enough to walk me out the door, but not fast enough to process my system access termination before the end of the business day on Friday of last week." He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it and set it on the counter beside the pile of cash. "The transfer of Mrs. Calloway's mortgage note from Natrona First to Pinnacle Development Group was executed on Thursday," Gareth said, "but the recording of that transfer with the Natrona County Clerk's office has not yet been completed. Mr. Price's counsel requested a delay in county recording to the end of the current fiscal quarter to manage the transfer tax liability." He looked at Price steadily, the look of a mild man who has arrived at the particular calm that comes when a mild man has finally decided that something matters more than his own comfort. "Until that county recording is complete, the note legally remains with Natrona First, and I retain authorized access to Natrona First deposit systems until 5 p.m. today when the weekend lockout protocol initiates." He took a small rubber stamp from his other shirt pocket, the kind of personal desk stamp that bank employees use for night deposit certification, and he set it beside the paper. "If I accept this cash deposit on behalf of Natrona First and issue a paid-in-full receipt," Gareth said, "the debt is legally discharged. The bank receives its money. The transfer to Pinnacle becomes moot because there is no longer a note to transfer." Price's lawyer had opened his briefcase again and was going through documents with the rapid intent focus of someone looking for a flaw in an argument that is being made faster than he can track. Price himself was looking at Gareth the way a man looks at something that has malfunctioned at the worst possible moment. "This is fraud," Price said. His voice was controlled, but the control was costing him something now. "This is collusion." "This is Aldridge." He turned to the lawyer. "Tell him this is fraud." The lawyer looked up from his documents. He was quiet for a moment. "The recording delay was your instruction," he said carefully. "That detail is accurate." The room was very still. Eli looked at Della in the corner. Della already had the camera up, already recording, and she gave him a single small nod. Eli turned back to Gareth. He picked up a bundle of cash from the pile on the counter and held it out. "Write the receipt, Gareth." Gareth took the money. His hands were shaking slightly, but he pulled the notepad from his pocket, uncapped a pen, and began writing with the careful, deliberate penmanship of a man who knows this document matters. He wrote for 30 seconds. He tore the page free. He pressed the rubber stamp to the ink pad he had also prepared. It seemed brought with him in his pocket, and he pressed it to the paper with both hands. He laid the receipt on the counter beside the pile of cash. Paid in full. The time on the receipt was 11:58. Ruth picked it up. She held it in both hands and looked at it, and the room was very quiet. Price stood still for a long moment. The hard hat, the Italian suit, the lawyer with his briefcase. The documents with their tabs and markers all irrelevant now. He looked at the receipt in Ruth's hands and then at Eli and then at the windows where 96 men in leather were standing on the sidewalk and in the street and in front of the bulldozers with the patient, outward-facing attention of a perimeter that has been established and intends to stay established. Outside, Deputy Cord Halsey was still beside his patrol car. He had moved slightly. He was leaning against the hood now, arms crossed, watching the front of the diner with the expression of a man who is deciding what his obligations are in a situation that is evolving faster than his briefing this morning had suggested it would. Price turned to Stax. Stax was a man who had made a professional life of being willing to do things that other people needed done. He had stood in front of debtors and resistant tenants and difficult situations of various kinds, and he had resolved them through the implicit presence of his size and the explicit threat of his willingness to use it. He looked out the window at 96 Hells Angels nomads standing in the July sun with their arms folded, and he did the arithmetic of the situation with the speed of a professional, and the arithmetic came out the same way every time. He shook his head, one small lateral movement, not for Price, for himself. Price looked at the lawyer. The lawyer was closing his briefcase. "You'll be hearing from my legal team," Price said. His voice had found a different register, now not the velvet authority of the opening, not the controlled fury of the middle, but the thin, compressed register of a man filing something away for later. "This transaction will be challenged. Every person in this room should consider themselves a potential defendant. I will bury this diner in litigation so deep it will take years and every dollar she has to fight her way out." He was looking at Ruth when he said it. Ruth looked back at him with the steady, unremarkable gaze of a woman who has heard threats before and has learned to distinguish between the ones that have weight behind them and the ones that are the last sound a man makes when he has run out of anything else. "Ride safe," Eli said pleasantly from behind him. Price turned and walked to the door. Stax followed. The lawyer followed, briefcase in hand. The door opened, the bell jingled, and the three of them stepped out into the July morning and the wall of silent, leather-clad men that lined the sidewalk, and they walked to Price's car, and they drove away. The diner was quiet. Then Della Hurst lowered her camera from her eye and let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for a long time, and from outside came a single sharp whistle, and then a sound that started low and built quickly into something between a cheer and a roar. 96 voices, in the particular quality of release that comes when men who have been holding a position are told they can stand down. Ruth stood behind the counter holding the receipt. Her knees were doing something unreliable. She put both hands flat on the counter and breathed and looked at the paid-in full stamp and at the mason jar of coins that Eli had pushed gently back toward her when he upended the bag, and at George's spatula on the hook above the grill, and at the framed business license on the wall with George's signature in blue ink. Then the door opened again and the bikers started coming in, and the diner that had been empty and silent all morning became within the space of 10 minutes the loudest and most alive it had been in years. Hammer went straight to the kitchen without being asked. Uwe washed his hands at the prep sink and turned the grill on. Ox appeared with a crate of eggs from somewhere. He had apparently taken the liberty of stopping at a grocery store on the way into Casper and set it on the prep table and looked through the pass-through at Ruth with the expression of a man waiting for direction. The jukebox in the corner, which had not worked since 2019, was apparently not beyond the skill set of a nomad named Briggs, who spent 15 minutes with the back panel open and then fed it $1 and stepped back as Johnny Cash came out of it like a man walking out of a long sentence. Ruth sat in booth 4. Eli sat across from her. It was in its way the same as it had been 21 years ago. The same booth, the same table, the same two people on opposite sides of it. Everything else was different. The boy was a man, the woman was 60, the denim jacket was gone, replaced by 40 pounds of leather and iron and road miles. But the way Eli held his coffee cup, both hands wrapped around it, drawing warmth from the ceramic, the way a man draws warmth from the only reliable things in his life, was exactly the same gesture Ruth had watched a 12-year-old boy make with a glass of milk on a rainy November night. He told her some of it, not all, the parts that mattered. After he left the diner that night in 2003, he had hitchhiked west. He had been running from a foster placement in a house where the man who ran it used his belt to solve problems, and the system had not been interested in what Eli had to say about it. He'd spent 3 years moving Nevada, Utah, and Northern California back to Nevada, doing what a boy without resources does to stay alive, none of which he described in detail, and Ruth did not ask him to. When he was 18, he had been sitting at a bar in Reno with $3 and a decision to make about what came next, and a man in a leather cut had sat down next to him and bought him a meal and asked him nothing about himself and offered him something that turned out to be a direction. He did what you did, Eli said. Sat with me while I ate, didn't ask for anything back. He looked out the window at his bike. I understood then that that's just what decent people do, and I decided I wanted to be a decent person. A pause, the sound of the grill, the sound of Johnny Cash, the sound of Casper going about its Friday around them. I never forgot this place, he said. Never forgot the booth, the meatloaf, the way you sat there and didn't push. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I always told myself when I had something worth bringing back, I'd come back. Ruth looked at him for a moment. How did you know, she asked, about price, about what was happening? We have ears, Eli said simply. Truckers, road people, word moves on the interstate the way it always has, person to person, stop to stop. Someone saw Della's video while at a truck stop in Rawlins and shared it to a forum I check. When I saw the name Ruth's counter, he stopped. I was in Sturgis with the boys. We were heading to a rally in Utah. He looked at her. I told them we needed to take a detour. All 97 of you. That's just the nomads who were at Sturgis. He allowed himself a small sideways expression that was not quite a smile. I made some calls, told them a woman who'd once saved my life was being bullied by a suit. Bikers hate suits, Ruth. It wasn't a hard sell. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Through the window, she could see Elm Street, the motorcycles lining the curb, the bikers moving between them and the sidewalk, the two bulldozers sitting blocked and inert at the end of the block with nobody in the cab and nowhere to go. Deputy Halsey was still there talking on his radio, and his expression from this distance still gave nothing away, but his decision to stay parked across the street and not cross it was its own kind of statement. It's not over, Ruth said. Eli's expression changed. The warmth didn't leave it, but something settled beneath it, the particular quality of attention of a man shifting from one mode into another, the way a hand shifts from open to closed. No, he said. He has lawyers. He has people on the city council. He has a lot to lose, Eli said. Men who have a lot to lose and just had it taken away don't go home and sleep. He looked at her steadily. Tonight. He'll come tonight. Not with lawyers and not with documents. Ruth felt the cold slide in under her ribs. She thought about what Stax had done to the tip jar. The casual, practiced ease of it. The way Price had not even looked at the broken glass on the floor when he walked out. You need to go to your sister's tonight, Eli said. You have a sister in Denver. Go. She looked at him. How do you... I did some reading before we rode in. He said it without apology. Go to Denver, just for tonight. Leave the building to us. You can't... Ruth. He said her name the way he had said it at the door 21 years ago, directly, simply, without performance. I kept a promise for 21 years to get here. I'm not going to let someone burn it down the night I arrive. The word burn settled in the air between them. Ruth looked at the spatula. She looked at the business license. She looked at the mason jar of coins sitting on the counter in the afternoon light, the old pennies and nickels and dimes inside it catching the light in small, dull gleams. Outside, Hammer leaned through the pass-through and called out that the pancakes were ready. An ox appeared from the kitchen, carrying a plate in each hand, and looked around the dining room for somewhere to put them. And the jukebox moved from Johnny Cash to Merle Haggard, and the diner filled up with the smell of coffee and bacon and hot butter on a cast-iron surface. And for a few hours, it was the most alive room in Casper, Wyoming, and maybe the most alive room Ruth had stood in since the last morning George had worked the grill. She took George's spatula down from the hook. She carried it to the back office and set it on the desk where she would remember to take it with her when she left for Denver. Some things you don't leave behind. She went to the pass-through and put on an apron and helped Hammer run the grill because the breakfast rush had become a lunch rush, and there were 100 men in her diner who had ridden a long way in July heat, and they were hungry. She fed them. That was what she knew how to do. Ruth drove to Denver in the dark. She left Casper at 8:45 after the diner had been cleaned and locked, and Eli had walked her to her car in the parking lot and stood there while she started the engine. Neither of them finding much to say that wasn't already understood. The sky above Wyoming was enormous and clear and full of stars in the way that skies in the West can be, not the polite handful of stars visible from a city, but the whole uncountable weight of them, the Milky Way, a broad smear of light from one horizon to the other, indifferent, impermanent, and quietly overwhelming. She drove south on Interstate 25 with the windows down and the night air coming in warm and dry, carrying the smell of sage and open ground. The highway was nearly empty at this hour. Her headlights reached out ahead of her into the dark and showed her the road and nothing beyond it. She thought about Eli. She thought about the way he had looked when she said she had wondered about him, the stillness that had come over him, the quality of it, like a man who has walked a long way in cold weather and has only just now been allowed to come inside and is not entirely certain the warmth is real. 21 years of carrying something. 21 years of being that boy in the denim jacket, carrying the memory of a diner and a plate of meatloaf and a woman who sat across the table and did not ask him anything because she understood at 39 what he needed more than questions. She thought about the receipt he had kept. A carbon copy receipt, the kind that comes off in 2 layers when you press the pen hard enough, the kind she had stopped using in 2007 when she switched to the thermal printer. He had kept it in his vest, presumably, or somewhere close to that, somewhere that meant it traveled with him, went where he went, sat in whatever drawer or box or pocket, held the things that mattered. For 21 years, through Nevada and Utah and wherever the road had taken him, through whatever the road had taken him through. She had wondered about him. Of course she had. She pulled into her sister Margaret's driveway in the Wash Park neighborhood of Denver at 11:15. Margaret was waiting up. Ruth had called from the road, and she opened the door before Ruth got to the porch and held it open and said nothing, which was the right thing, which was the thing Ruth needed, which was why Margaret had always been the sister Ruth called when things were genuinely bad rather than merely difficult. They sat in the kitchen and drank decaf, and Ruth told her sister the story from the beginning, the whole of it, and Margaret listened the way good listeners listen, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually following Ruth into the narrative, her face moving through its responses honestly and without management. When Ruth finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment. 97, she said. 97, Ruth confirmed. Margaret looked at her coffee cup. George would have loved this story. Ruth smiled. It surprised her the smile arrived before she could decide about it, real and uncomplicated. He would have put it on a sign in the window. She did not sleep. She tried in the guest room that smelled of Margaret's fabric softener and the faint cedar of the closet lying on her back in the dark with her hands folded on her stomach. But her mind kept going back to Casper, to the diner, to the dark building on the corner of Elm and 3rd with Eli and his men, somewhere inside it, waiting in the dark for something she did not want to think about too precisely. She checked her phone. Midnight, 12:30. 1. At 1:47, she got up and went to the kitchen and made tea and sat at Margaret's table in the dark and watched the screen of her phone and waited. Back in Casper, the diner was dark and still. The closed sign was turned in the window. The parking lot was empty, swept clean of the afternoon's 100 visitors and their machines, every coffee cup washed and stacked, every table wiped, the grill scraped and cooling. To a person driving past on Elm Street, it looked exactly as a closed diner looks: inert, locked, finished for the night. Inside, nothing moved. Eli was on a stool near the back exit, the one that opened into the alley behind the building. He had turned the stool so his back was to the wall, and he could see both the kitchen and the pass-through into the dining room. He had been sitting there for 4 hours. He was not restless. Restlessness was a thing he had worked out of himself a long time ago, on long watches in cold places. He sat with the particular patience of a man who has learned that waiting is not wasted time, but simply time that has not yet revealed its purpose. Hammer was at the window beside the refrigeration unit position so he could see the alley approach from the south. He had been a line cook before he had been anything else, and he had the cook's habit of running through mental checklists in idle moments: miss place, prep, sequence, timing. It kept the mind occupied without distracting it. Ox was at the front window of the dining room in the dark, far enough from the glass that he was not visible from outside. He was the largest man in the group, which made him paradoxically easy to overlook, because the eye tends to process very large things as furniture rather than as threats until the moment they move. Three other nomads, Briggs, who had fixed the jukebox, and two men named Cutler and Farr, were positioned in the kitchen and at the emergency exit at the far end of the dining room. All of them had been in tighter spaces than this. All of them had waited longer. Della Hurst was not in the diner. She was in a car parked half a block north on Elm Street, a dark sedan she had borrowed from her neighbor, sitting low in the driver's seat with her camera on the passenger seat and her laptop open on her knees, the screen dimmed all the way down. She had three things running simultaneously: a live stream to the Casper Records YouTube channel, a direct feed to the camera Eli had let her mount on the kitchen wall above the hood vent, and a voice connection to Eli's flip phone that would stay open until one of them ended it. The camera above the hood vent was small, a trail camera that Briggs had produced from somewhere in his saddlebags, the kind used for wildlife monitoring, compact and motion activated and capable of operating in near total darkness. It was positioned to cover the back door and most of the kitchen floor. The live stream had 700 viewers at midnight. By 1 in the morning, it had 1,200, most of them people who had seen the afternoon's events and had come back to the channel to see what happened next. By 2 in the morning, it had over 4,000, fed by shares and cross posts and the particular algorithm of late-night internet attention that routes toward things happening in real time. Della watched the viewer count climb and said nothing into the open phone line. At 2:17, she said, "Dark van, coming north on the alley from the direction of 2nd Street. No headlights." Eli's voice came back, "Copy." Slowing down, stopping behind the diner. "Copy. Stay on the stream. Do not move the car." The van stopped. It sat for 90 seconds with no visible activity, the standard pause of people about to do something they would prefer not to do in front of witnesses, reassuring themselves that there are no witnesses. The night was quiet. The alley was dark. The diner looked exactly as empty as they needed it to look. The side door of the van slid open. Three men got out. They wore dark hoodies and dark pants and the kind of balaclava face coverings that are sold in ski shops and have no other common application. Two of them carried red plastic gasoline canisters of the 5-gallon variety, the standard ones. The ones you buy at any hardware store, nothing unusual about them except what they were being carried toward. The third man carried a pry bar and something in his jacket pocket that produced a slight rectangular bulk at the hip. They moved to the back door of the diner. They moved with the quiet efficiency of people who have thought about this in advance, not professionals in the highest sense, not people who do this for the primary part of their living, but people who have been told what to do and have spent enough time thinking about it to feel prepared. Stax took the pry bar to the door frame. The old wood gave on the second application a crack that was loud in the alley quiet and then was absorbed by the night and the ambient sound of the city around them. The door swung inward. The three men stepped into the kitchen. They moved quickly through the dark, and the gasoline smell arrived before the liquid did the sharp, immediate chemical presence of it, filling the kitchen air before the first canister was even open. They poured with practiced efficiency along the base of the grill, across the rubber floor mats, under the prep tables, soaking the wooden shelving units, along the wall where the dry goods were kept. One of the canisters made it to the dining room, and a trail poured across the threshold and along the baseboard of the window wall. The man with the rectangular bulk in his jacket pocket took it out. It was a road flare, the standard triangular emergency type red, the kind carried in every vehicle emergency kit in America. He held it in his right hand and looked at the two men with the canisters, confirming they were done, and he raised it to strike it against the rough strip on the side. Every light in the building came on simultaneously. The fluorescent kitchen lights, the dining room overheads, the work lights above the prep tables, the light above the back door, all of them together triggered from the main breaker panel that Hammer had been standing beside for the last 4 hours, with his hand on the switch, waiting for this exact moment. The three men froze. Human eyes do not adapt instantly from complete darkness to full commercial kitchen lighting. There are approximately 2 seconds of effective blindness. In those 2 seconds, the back door slammed shut, Cutler on the outside, pulling it closed and holding it, and the sound of the front door of the diner opening and Ox's footsteps crossing the dining room floor completed the sealing of the exits. When the three men could see again, they saw Eli. He was standing in the center of the kitchen, arms crossed in the same position he might have occupied if he had been waiting for a delivery. He was not holding anything. He did not appear to be in any particular hurry. He looked at the three men with the flare and the empty canisters and the gasoline soaking into the floor mats with the same expression of mild professional disappointment he had worn when he looked at Price that afternoon. Hammer stood to Eli's left, holding a cast iron skillet with one hand, the way a man holds a tool of his trade. Briggs stood to his right, doing nothing, which was in some ways more effective. "Evening, gentlemen," Eli said. His voice was conversational and entirely calm, the voice of a man who has arrived early to a meeting and is remarking on the fact. "That's high-grade gasoline, expensive stuff." He looked at the canisters. "Shame to waste it." The man with the flare stacks, the lower half of his face covered by the balaclava, recognizable nonetheless by his build and his posture, and the particular way he stood, which Ruth would have known from 20 feet away, raised the flare. "Back off," Stack said. "I'll strike it. I'll burn us all." Eli looked at him. He took one step forward. "You think I'm scared of fire, son," he said. His voice had not changed. It was still conversational, still unhurried. "I've been to hell and back 4 times on roads you haven't seen yet. You're just a tourist." Stax's hand was shaking. Not much. A man like Stax does not shake much. But the hand holding the flare was not entirely steady, and the unsteadiness came from something more specific than fear. It came from looking into a pair of blue eyes that were absolutely, completely, genuinely unafraid, and realizing that the thing you were counting on to create leverage the thing that was supposed to make the other person step back was not working. The hesitation lasted less than 2 seconds. Eli moved. For a man his size, he moved with a speed that was almost unreasonable. Not the explosive speed of someone who has been coiled and waiting, but the efficient mechanical speed of someone who has performed this kind of action many times and has eliminated every unnecessary motion from it. He covered the distance between himself and Stax in 2 steps. His right hand came out and closed around Stax's wrist, and he twisted with a precise, controlled torque that took the joint to its limit and then passed it. The snap was quiet and definitive. Stax made a sound that was not a word. The flare dropped from his hand and hit the gasoline-soaked floor mat, and Ruth would have stopped breathing if she had been there to see it, but the floor mat was wet-soaked through, and the flare skittered across it and lay there hissing in a small pool of the liquid without finding purchase, without catching the chemistry of it, wrong by just enough. Briggs put his boot on the flare and pressed down. The other two men had turned for the dining room door when Eli moved. They made it through the pass-through and approximately 6 feet into the dining room before Ox stepped out of the dark corner by the window, and they ran into him, which was more or less like two men running into a wall that has decided to become inconveniently present. They went down. Farr had them zip-tied in 30 seconds, his movements quick, and practiced the way a man zip-ties people when it is not the first time he has done it. Stax was on his knees in the kitchen, his broken wrist cradled against his chest, and Eli was crouching in front of him. Eli reached up and pulled the balaclava from Stax's face. He looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Stax," he said with a kind of tired familiarity. "I had hoped it would be someone I didn't recognize." He held up the flip phone. The screen was showing the open call to Della, and the number on the screen indicated it had been connected for 4 hours and 23 minutes, and the small red dot in the corner of the display indicated that the live stream was active and had been active since the call connected. 4,600 people just watched you pour the game," Eli said. "Say hello." Stax looked at the phone. He looked at Eli. He looked at the gasoline on the floor and his broken wrist, and the two men zip-tied in the dining room, and the kitchen, full of very large, very calm people who had clearly been in this room for hours waiting for exactly this to happen. Sirens, faint at first from the direction of Center Street, then getting closer with a steady, purposeful increase in volume of vehicles that know exactly where they are going. Eli waited. "Before they get here," he said quietly. He held the phone steady between himself and Stax, the camera facing outward. "I want you to tell the people watching right now who sent you to this building tonight. Loud enough for the phone to pick up." Stax was crying, not dramatically, not with any performance to it. Simply the involuntary physical response of a man whose wrist is broken and whose future has just become very small in a very short period of time. He looked at the phone and he looked at the door and he looked at Eli. "Price," he said. "Full name. Conrad Price." His voice was stronger on the second attempt. Anger has a way of clarifying the voice even when everything else is falling apart. "Conrad Price sent us $10,000 to torch the building and make it look like a wiring fault. He said the insurance payout would let him buy the land at auction for less than the sale price." A pause. He's done this before. The sirens were close now. Blue and red light was flickering against the alley wall outside the back door. "How many times?" Eli said. Stax looked at him. "How many other buildings?" Eli said. "4, Stax said. "That I know about. Gillette, Buffalo, Douglas, one in Torrington. All small business owners who wouldn't sell, all ruled accidental." He looked at his wrist. "He has people in the fire marshal's office." In the car, half a block north on Elm Street, Delahurst was watching the live stream counter tick past 6,000 viewers and typing simultaneously into a text message to a contact at the Wyoming Tribune Eagle, a message that read, "Call me right now. I have everything on record." Deputy Cord Halsey came through the back door of the diner at 3:04 in the morning with 2 other officers behind him, and he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment taking in the scene. The gasoline-soaked floor, the broken flare, the zip-tied men, the enormous biker crouched calmly in the middle of it all with a flip phone in his hand, and his face did something complicated. Then he reached for his radio. "I'm going to need additional units on Elm Street," he said into it, "and I need someone to run a location on a Conrad Price. Try his residence first, then the Pinnacle Development offices, then the Casper-Natrona County Airport." A pause. "Private terminal specifically." Ruth's phone buzzed at 3:19. She was at Margaret's kitchen table, both hands around a mug of tea that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at the live stream on her phone screen. She had watched all of it, the van, the dark figures, the gasoline, the lights coming on, the confrontation, the arrest. She had watched it on a 4-inch screen in her sister's kitchen in Denver, and she had not made a sound through any of it, barely breathed, one hand flat on the table and the other holding the phone with a grip that left white marks on her fingers. The text was from Eli. "Building's fine. They've got stacks. Price ran for the airport. Halsey's on it. Get some sleep." She read it 3 times. Then she put the phone face down on the table and pressed both hands over her eyes and sat there for a long time in the dark behind her palms. Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway in her robe summoned by some sister instinct, and she looked at Ruth at the table, and she went to the cabinet and got down the bottle of bourbon she kept for emergencies, and poured 2 glasses without asking, and set one in front of Ruth and sat down. They did not say anything for a while. "He's okay?" Margaret asked finally. "They're all okay," Ruth said. "The building's okay." Margaret nodded. She picked up her glass. "George always said the good ones come back." Ruth looked at her. "He used to say it about customers," Margaret said. "Feed them right and they come back. Treat them like people and they remember." She looked at her glass. "Sounds like he was right about more than food." Ruth picked up her bourbon. She slept 4 hours, which was more than she had expected. She was back in Casper by 7:30 Saturday morning. She turned onto Elm Street and stopped the car. The street was full. Not with motorcycles this time, though the motorcycles were still there lined along the curb in a long, gleaming row chrome, catching the early morning light. It was full of people, neighbors she recognized, shop owners from the next block, a family she had never seen before with 2 children who had apparently driven up from Cheyenne after watching the live stream. Old Mr. Fenwick in his windbreaker, standing with a coffee cup from somewhere talking to a woman Ruth thought might be from the city council. The Alderman sisters, Patrice and Gwen, standing arm in arm by the front window. Della was on the sidewalk, camera in hand, talking on her phone with the controlled intensity of a journalist processing more story than she could handle at the rate it was arriving. As Ruth opened the car door, someone saw her. The clapping started with Della. She lowered the camera from her eye and started it, a single person's applause, and it caught the way these things catch when the moment is right and the feeling is real. It moved through the crowd in a wave genuine and loud, the kind of applause that is not polite and not performed, but is simply what happens when a feeling needs a physical form. Ruth stood beside her car and looked at all of it, the people, the morning light, the diner with its neon sign humming in the window, the sign George had painted by hand that summer in 1991, and she was not ready for any of it, which was perhaps the only way to receive it honestly. Eli separated himself from a group near the entrance. He looked like a man who had not slept, which he hadn't, but who had also arrived at the particular clarity that sometimes comes on the other side of a long and consequential night. He had a push broom in one hand and grease on his forearm, and he looked entirely at home. "Morning, boss," he said. Ruth walked toward him. She looked at the door. The frame where Stax had put the pry bar was splintered at the strike plate, but a steel reinforcement plate had been bolted over the damage, rough and functional, the work of someone who had a drill and a piece of steel and had applied them in the middle of the night. "The building," she started. "Is fine," Eli said. "Kitchen floor needs a cleaning. The back door frame needs a proper carpenter, but it'll hold." He leaned on the broom. Halsey took Stax and the other two at 308. Stax kept talking all the way to the station. Once he realized Price wasn't coming to help him, he decided to be thorough about it. "The intimidation campaign against you. The health inspection, bribes 4 other properties." He remembered dates, names. He gave them everything. "And Price." Eli's expression shifted into the territory of something that was not quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man watching a long-standing account come into balance. "Caught at the private terminal at Casper Natrona," he said. He had a bag. The FBI was already there when Halsey's call went out, because apparently when 6,000 people to live stream a man confessing to arson and 4 prior incidents of the same, the field office in Cheyenne considers it an expedited matter. He paused. "He's looking at federal arson charges, racketeering, bribery of a public official, and whatever the prosecutors decide to add once they've had time to read through Stax's complete statement. No bail. His lawyers are working on it, but they're working uphill." Another pause. "Pinnacle Development Group issued a press release at 6 this morning. They're calling him a rogue element. All claims against your property have been withdrawn." Ruth looked at him for a moment. "They offered to pay for the door repairs," Eli added, "for goodwill purposes." "What did you say?" "I told them we handle our own repairs." Ruth looked at the reinforcement plate on the doorframe, rough, immediate, practical. The work of men who saw a problem and addressed it with what they had. "Thank you," she said. Eli shook his head once. "Don't." "Eli, don't thank me for this, Ruth." He said it without hardship in his voice. "Let me just have done it." She understood that. She nodded. Inside, Hammer was already at the grill. The breakfast crowd was beginning to fill the booths and the counter stools, and the sound of the diner and the morning coffee, percolating orders, called through the pass-through the bell above the door marking arrivals. The low conversational hum of people gathered in a warm room. Overfood was filling the space. The way sound fills a room that has been too quiet for too long and is grateful to have something to carry. The GoFundMe, Della told her at one point during the morning rush, had passed $180,000 in the night. Donations from Wyoming and Colorado and Texas, and further from people who had watched the live stream or seen the clips shared across platforms, from people who had never been to Casper and never would be, who had simply watched a woman hold her ground and wanted to be part of what happened next. Ruth worked the grill beside Hammer. She flipped pancakes and turned bacon and ladled gravy and called orders and refilled coffee and did all of it with the same focused attention she had brought to every morning in this kitchen for 23 years, except that this morning the weight that had lived in her shoulders for 6 months was gone. And without it, she felt lighter than she had expected. Not euphoric, not triumphant, just present in the way a person is present when the thing they were bracing for has passed, and the world is simply the world again, going about its business. Around 2 in the afternoon, the quality of sound in the diner changed, not dramatically, not all at once. But Ruth heard it from the kitchen, a slight shift in the room's frequency, the particular quality of a gathering that is preparing to become a departure. The bikers were finishing their near coffees. They were zipping their cuts. They were moving with the collective, unhurried purpose of men who have been somewhere long enough and know what comes next. Ruth took off her apron. She came out of the kitchen and walked through the diner and the customers, who were still there locals, people who had come in after the morning rush and settled in for the long pleasure of a Saturday. At a counter they had missed made room for her to pass, and a few of them reached out and touched her arm as she went by, brief and genuine, the language of people who don't have words for what they mean. Outside, the motorcycles were starting. One by one, then in clusters, the engines turned over and caught and added their voices to the accumulating sound until the air on Elm Street was vibrating with the deep, layered, resonant frequency of 97 machines awake and ready. Eli was at his bike. The massive custom chopper, blacked out entirely matte frame and matte engine, and black pipes stood at the head of the column the way it had stood when he arrived, patient, certain, facing west. He had his helmet under his arm, and he was looking up the street toward the mountains, the way people who spend their lives on roads look at the horizon, not with longing exactly, but with recognition, with the particular comfort of someone who is most at home in motion. Ruth walked out to him. Out. The crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk, in the parking lot, and the edges of the street made a natural path for her opening and closing behind her, and the sound of it all, the engines, the street, the voices, was enormous in a way that should have felt overwhelming but didn't, because at the center of it, the space between her and Eli was entirely quiet. "You can't stay for dinner," she said. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved. "Road calls." He was already strapping his helmet. "Besides, if we stay too long, Halsey will remember he's supposed to write us up for the parking." Ruth reached into her apron pocket. She had put the apron back on at some point without thinking about it, the same way she always moved through the morning, and the apron had the pocket with the order pad and the pen, and now the thick envelope she had put there when Gareth left the diner the previous afternoon, with the remaining cash counted out and bundled. She held the envelope out to him. "Eli," she said, "please, the donations this morning in the business, I have more than enough. I can pay off the mortgage and fix the roof and the door and still have money left over. This is too much. Take it back." He looked at the envelope. He reached out with his gloved hand, and for a moment she thought he was going to take it, and she was already feeling the complicated mix of relief and loss that comes with giving something back that you know you should not keep. But he closed her fingers around it. He pushed her hand gently back toward her chest, the way you close a door you want to stay closed. "That's not a loan," he said. "Then tell me what it is." He looked at her for a long moment. The engines were running behind him, 96 machines, and the men on them, and the whole street was vibrating, and the crowd was watching, and the morning was enormous around them. But he spoke quietly, pitched only for her. "Restitution," he said. "For 21 years, I carried the weight of being that hungry boy. I carried the shame of it, the shame of needing something that bad, the shame of not having the means to pay for what I needed." He looked down at the envelope in her hands, and then back up at her face. "When you fed me that night, you didn't just give me calories, Ruth. You fed me like I was worth something. And when the whole world, every system, every person in authority, everyone who should have been looking out for me had decided I wasn't worth much at all, you treated me like a human being, without asking for anything back, without making me feel the debt of it." He paused. "That money is paper," he said. "What you gave me, I've been spending that my whole life, every time I sat with someone who needed it. Every time I didn't ask for anything back. Every time I tried to be the decent thing in someone else's bad night." He looked at her steadily. "That's yours. That's what you put into the world 21 years ago. I'm just returning it in the only currency I've got." Ruth did not speak. She was not going to be able to speak for a moment, and she knew it, and she did not try. She turned and walked back into the diner and went to the register and opened the drawer beneath it and took out the mason jar. The small mason jar with the pennies and nickels and dimes inside it, the coins that had been sitting in that drawer for 21 years through every season and every difficulty. And every morning she had gotten up and opened the door because the door needed to be open. She came back outside. She held the jar out to him. Eli looked at it. He was a large man with large hands, and the hands she noticed were not entirely steady when he reached out and took the jar from her. He held it and looked at the coins inside, the old copper of the pennies, the worn silver of the nickels and dimes, the way they caught the afternoon light through the glass. He turned it slowly, the way you turn something you have been trying to imagine for a long time and are only now holding for the first time. You kept them, he said. His voice had lost its steadiness entirely, and he did not seem to care about that. 21 years, Ruth said. He turned the jar in his hands once more. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up at her, and she saw in his face what she had seen 21 years ago in a boy sitting in booth 4 on a rainy night, the specific expression of someone who has been carrying the weight of their own unworthiness for so long that being seen, truly seen, is almost more than they know how to hold. He put the jar carefully in the interior pocket of his leather cut close to his chest. He put on his helmet. He swung his leg over the bike, the leather creaking under his weight, and settled into the seat with the ease of someone returning to their proper element, and he looked down at her from that height. Then he raised his fist. It went up slowly, deliberately, and behind him, 96 fists rose in unison, a single, synchronized gesture, total and absolute. A salute that had no words because the words were inadequate, and everyone present understood that. Ruth raised her hand, not a fist, just her hand open the way you wave at someone you love who is going somewhere. Eli kicked the bike into gear. The sound that came from 97 Harley-Davidson engines engaging simultaneously was not a sound so much as a physical event, a concussive wave of mechanical force that moved through the chest and the stomach and the bones, that shook the windows of Ruth's counter and rattled the neon sign and lifted the hair on the arms of everyone standing within 100 yards of it. The crowd on the sidewalk stepped back instinctively and then stepped forward again, drawn by the same force that makes people move towards something enormous and kinetic and briefly perfectly itself. Eli peeled out onto Elm Street, a long squeal of rubber and a blast of exhaust. And then he was moving west, and the column fell in behind him, bike by bike, and the procession moved down Elm Street in a river of chrome and black leather, and the deep percussion of all those engines together, and the crowd on the sidewalk cheered and waved, and some of them pressed their hands together, like people who have just witnessed something they will not fully understand for a while. Ruth stood in the middle of the parking lot. She watched until the last tail light turned at the end of Elm Street, and the sound began to fade, moving west and south toward the interstate, toward Utah, toward the horizon that had no opinion about what the day had brought and would bring the same indifferent sky tomorrow regardless. The silence that settled back over Elm Street in their wake was different from the silence before they came. Before, the silence had been the silence of a place diminishing, a diner losing its traffic, a block being cleared for something that did not care what had been there. It had been the silence of ending. This silence was different. This was the silence of a place that had been tested and had held. The silence of walls still standing. The silence of a story that is not over. Ruth went back inside. She went to the register and stood behind the counter in her proper place, and she looked around the diner the way you look at something when you have been afraid of losing it and have not yet fully understood that you are not going to lose it. The checkerboard linoleum, the 8 red vinyl stools, the padded booths along the window wall, the pass-through, the hook above the grill. She reached up and took George's spatula down from the hook. She held it in both hands, the handle worn smooth in the shape of his grip, 30 years of mornings, in the wood of it, and then she set it back, in its place, on its hook. She went to the wall where the framed business license hung, George's signature in blue ink in the lower right corner, and she took the 2 receipts from her apron pocket, the carbon copy from 2003, yellow and fragile, and Gareth Pullman's handwritten paid-in-full receipt from yesterday, fresh and ink dark. And she took a piece of tape from the dispenser on the counter and taped them to the wall side by side next to George's frame. 2 pieces of paper, 21 years apart, the beginning of a debt and the end of it. She stood back and looked at them. Then she went to the cabinet under the register where the mason jar had lived for 2 decades, the jar that was now tucked inside a leather vest moving west on Interstate 25. And she set in its place a small framed photograph she had brought in this morning from the car, a photograph of George at the grill taken in the summer of 1995, laughing at something someone had said just off camera, the spatula in his hand, the diner behind him full of people and morning light. She had been carrying it in her bag for a week without knowing quite why. Some things you carry without knowing why, and then the right place for them appears. Sometime around noon, Della had put the camera down. Ruth had seen her do it from across the diner, set it on the counter, with the deliberate finality of a person deciding that some moments are better witnessed than recorded, and pick up a dish towel instead. Now her voice came from the kitchen. Ruth orders up, "Table 4 wants to know if you're still doing the meatloaf today." Ruth looked at the clock. Saturday, not Tuesday. She thought about Eli's hands around a coffee cup. About the meatloaf special, $8.50, served to a boy who had needed it on a rainy November night that neither of them would ever forget for the rest of their lives. "Tell them yes," she called back. "Tell them I'll make it today." She went into the kitchen and turned on the grill. The bell above the front door jingled. Then again, a couple she didn't recognize came in, tourists by the look of them, a man and a woman in their 60s with Wyoming road dust on their clothes, and the slightly dazed expression of people who have been driving for a while and are grateful for the sight of a place to stop. "Are you still open?" the man asked, looking around at the occupied booths, the working kitchen, the living warmth of the room. "We saw the motorcycles leaving from the highway, pulled off to see what was going on." Ruth looked at them from behind the counter. She looked at the booth by the heater booth. 4 empty, now the red vinyl worn soft by 23 years of people sitting in it and eating and staying for a while, because the room was warm and the food was good and nobody asked them anything they didn't want to answer. She looked at the 2 receipts on the wall beside George's frame. She looked at the photograph of George laughing at the grill. She picked up the coffee pot. "Come on in," she said. "Kitchen's always open."